And welcome. This is the Hypnotorious Podcast. David Barron and John Wylie. John, how you doing today?
Hey everybody, I'm doing great.
And just if this is the first time you've joined, I just like to make it clear every time that what we talk about is about everything related to hypnosis, influence, neurolinguistic programming, and it really is for as wide an audience as possible. We try and get it as interesting so that just those people who on the periphery who think hypnosis and influence is really interesting can have something of value. But we also want to apply it to those people who are professionals, who are professional hypnotists and really sort of up their game and give it a good skill. John is a professional hypnotist, been doing it for about 10 years. In Boise, Idaho, he has it's Boise Hypnotherapy. Is that correct?
That's actually the website, yeah. Boise Hypnotherapist is the website, and then the name of the business is Boise Hypnosis.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah. And I am David Barron. I have Eastern Oregon Hypnosis, and I also operate New Hampshire Hypnosis on the East Coast. So I've got my fingers widely stretched across the United States, so to speak. What we sort of agreed to talk about is something that I think is going to really dig into a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. First of all, it's culturally very fascinating. It's also slightly frightening, but it's also incredibly informative. And I wanted to specifically talk about some of the techniques that have been used by specifically Charles Manson back in the 60s to influence these young impressionable people to do horrific murders. Now the reason let's both just get it out there. We do not want anyone to start a cult. So that's right up there. We don't want to have anyone influence other people to commit crimes or murders. So that's out there.
Especially a cult like that.
Yeah, agreed. But when you look at this and the techniques that are explained here, it gives you some real insight about how people are influenced and some very useful tools to apply in your own life in very positive and beneficial ways. So as frightening, as negative as Charles Manson is, we're going to look at some things that he did that helped sort of influence people to make them do things and talk about how they can be useful in the right context.
Yeah.
All right? Okay.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. If for no other reason, David, then so that people can protect themselves.
Right.
You know, to be familiar with these techniques and the way that he did things so that we can be on our guard for things that might happen to us like that. So carry on. This is really interesting.
Now, we are not the information police. So this is for now, and so that if you want to read about this in more detail, I write under a pseudonym of Dantalian Jones. I wrote a book some time ago called Building Your Cult. And this information I have recently added to it. So if you want to get this information, get the most recent edition of Building Your Cult by Dantalian Jones. It is available on Amazon, and if possible, I'll provide a link here, but you can just search for it on Amazon. To give credit to the origin of this was mentioned in a very brief form by Chase Hughes, who's been on our show recently.
Yeah.
And he provided 10 very lucid observations about Charles Manson that sort of explained how he was able to get this quality of influence over people. So I want to give him full credit for the inspiration of this really extended addition to the book. I guess, and one of the very best places that I think we can start is with the study done by Stanley Milgram on compliance. And Stanley Milgram, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, he was in Yale University, and he wanted to find out how far people would go if someone of authority just said, do this. And so he had a very, should be a culturally sort of familiar setup now. He had a fellow in a lab coat who would give people instructions. 2 volunteers would come in. They would be divided into the teacher and the learner. And the learner was instructed to memorize pairs of words and then recite them on command. The teacher was instructed to give him a shock every time he got it wrong. Now, the person in the role of the learner was actually a Confederate. He never did receive a shock. But the person who played the teacher, who administered these shocks, thought that this was a real situation. And the shocks that they delivered went all the way up from light shock to triple X, danger, warning, however extreme you could get. And the only thing that the only encouragement that the teacher had was the fellow in the lab coat saying, it's essential you continue this experiment. This experiment is dependent on your continuing. Just very simple instructions. Please continue. And depending on how the study is set up, anywhere from 60 to 80% of the people in the role of the teacher went all the way up to triple X and shocked this person until they thought he was dead.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you put this in the right context, basically you need to understand that all it takes is a person in a lab coat giving you instructions to make you commit murder. How does that take place? I mean, that's sort of an awesome way of looking at it in that context.
Yeah. People need to stop and think about that for a second.
And what came from this was what Milgram referred to as the agentic state. And that is where the person in the role of the teacher, becomes an agent to a bigger process, an agent to this experiment. And in doing that does not accept the consequences necessarily of their actions. Now, you can think of this in a lot of different ways. Of course, the origin of this study happened from the Nuremberg trials, when they tried to find out how all of these people willingly committed these atrocities and just basically said, I was following orders.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially they were saying that, I was not responsible, I was an agent to this process. And so the key here, and again we're going back to Charles Manson, is how to get people into this agentic state where they feel they are not solely responsible and not responsible for the consequences of their actions, but just part of a process. Now, what I'd like to point out is, and this is useful for anyone who wants to do this, Charles Manson certainly did this. Many cults do it. Many corporations do it. They have what's called a grand vision. And a grand vision is basically something that says, you're a part of something bigger.
Right. Many religions do that too. Virtually all religions.
All religions do it, yeah. And a good company does that too, because it enlists the person to feel as though they're part of something bigger than themselves. I've worked for companies in which I loved that feeling. I was just glad to contribute to the part of this vision. So for those of you who want to sort of gain this type of influence over people, think first of what kind of grand vision can you give to these people. If it's a business, then maybe your business is to, give me some ideas here, John. What would be a grand vision for a great business?
Well, I mean, the preeminent example that pops right to mind for me is Tesla. Take a look at what Tesla does. Tesla recruits really bright, extremely talented kids right out of college, and their grand vision is, their purpose is to change the world. That's really what they want to do. And with that grand vision that Elon Musk communicates very powerfully to the employees of all of his companies, but Tesla in particular, those kids will work long hours. They really don't make an extraordinary income. They're paid, average or slightly above average for what they do, but they dedicate themselves to that grand vision of changing the world, and you can see the results.
Yeah, and Elon Musk did not originate this. I mean, you can go back to Steve Jobs.
Right, he's another good example.
Another good example, and Microsoft, they would do exactly what you said. They take
Bill Gates.
Yeah, they take these young people out of college with skills that have no experience as to what it's like to work in a business, and make them essential slaves, and they don't mind. They don't.
No, they're excited. They're motivated to do that.
And this is true in any political movement. If you feel you're a part of something bigger, you simply want to contribute more. Mm-hmm. So think of it in terms of a grand vision in every case. And of course, Charles Manson was able to do this. He was a total nut job. He was a psychopath. People to him were instruments. They weren't any sort of means to an end, but they were means to an end, but not really ends in themselves. And so if you look at him in this mindset, you'll see how these 10 qualities we'll mention here influenced him. So just going over them one at a time. First of all, the very first one, and again, I'm going to attribute all of this not to myself, but to Chase Hughes. His very first one was unmatched self-confidence. And that simply means in any environment, there was no one who felt more in control and more confident of himself than, in this case, Charles Manson. And that is probably true of your example of Elon Musk, too.
He's got a serious ego, I'm sure.
Yeah, and it means people, and when you think of it being unmatched, you can think of people who have really high self-confidence, but his would always be even more self-confident. And this can be demonstrated in a lot of different ways. A little more risk-taking in social environments, for example, as well as being able to talk to people in a way that is direct yet different from other people. A little exercise that I sort of ask people to do is just forget about self-confidence as a benefit. Think of it as an overpowering sickness. So like you are just overcome with this sense of purpose, of power, of control, and nothing can faze you. And if you start with that in mind, you can have a lot of influence with people. And you'll notice that if you start with that self-confidence, things that might have affected you in the past tend not to. So, what would you say about this?
Well, what I would say is that's actually pretty accurate, because in the case of Charles Manson, it was an overpowering sickness. I mean, he obviously had some serious mental disorder going on there, but being what we like to think is more well-adjusted, I would hope, than him. Even more mentally healthy people can use kind of a similar strategy to practice expanding that sense of self-confidence.
Right. And think about having that sense of self-confidence, that certainty in yourself when you're talking about a grand vision. It multiplies it in magnitudes. So that's something to really consider. And if you if you want to start to influence a group, think about what your vision is for that group. John and I were starting a local meetup, or restarting a local meetup, where we're teaching some of these skills with people. And my first of all, my grand vision is to teach good skills, but to make sure they are having an incredible amount of fun, so they come back, and ultimately sort of getting it to grow bigger and bigger. So we've sort of agreed on that as a good grand vision to start with, and I know we can do it. So it's going to be a blast.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
The second thing that Chase Hughes had mentioned about Charles Manson, his actions were without reservation or hesitation. And that again goes back to self-confidence, but it also goes back to the fact that he was a bit of a psychopath. And psychopaths, sociopaths, they don't feel fear.
Right.
Usually they'll do something bold, ridiculous, and dangerous. And if it has a bad result, which it certainly can, it has no real effect on them. They just do something more bold, dangerous, and ridiculous. And when you do this in a context of people like Charles Manson's followers, who had no experience with this at all, they see confidence. So he would say something, he would act on it immediately. Of course, I would highly recommend you clarify your own personal set of ethics before you try acting without hesitation, but also consider what strength that has. The number 3 in this is his sense of belief in his own power. Now, he believed he was the savior, so this was entirely delusional. He believed he had a privilege and a right to influence these people to do things. But that belief in his own power, for some people, made them feel as though he was an authority, and just enlisted them into that agenic state, that state where they just become a part of something bigger. If anything comes to mind here of insights and stuff like this, John, please contribute. I'm just sort of going through the list here, but there's a lot we can talk about.
Oh, yeah. I was kind of saving it to the end, but...
okay, yeah, great.
Carry on.
One of the things that, as far as beliefs about yourself, the beliefs in your own ability, you can start by making a list and saying things like, and writing it down, I believe I can, and go for the big ones. I believe I can, make $1 million. I believe I can become the preeminent hypnotist in my area. And then on top of that, adding to that the I deserve, because a lot of people think they can, but they don't deserve it. So once you start to influence your sense of power and sense of control, it does start to take on a life of its own.
Right. One thing I would like to point out is, all these things that we're talking about with Charles Manson, all of these things, as far as how he created this powerful leadership personality, none of these things are necessarily based on truth. Okay, it's important that people understand that this is not just anything inherently even beneficial about Charles Manson. These are all just perceptions that he created.
Yeah, their beliefs. Right? Yeah, I like to point out beliefs don't have to be true, and they often aren't.
Right.
They're just useful.
Yeah, exactly.
They're just really useful. So it would, and so I'll point out to people who feel like they can't talk and do public speaking.
Sure you can.
And I will just ask them to look at that belief. How much does that belief alone hold you back? Just that belief in itself. And they start to look at the belief as, okay, this might be something, if I believe differently, I'd probably be willing to speak more. So, yeah, the beliefs don't have to be true, but they're usually very useful. Now,
in fact, they're usually not true.
Yes.
especially in the beginning. But the cool thing about those kinds of things is that they do tend to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you fake it till you make it, the less you have to fake it.
Absolutely.
The more genuine it becomes.
Right.
Yeah.
Now the fourth technique that he used, which first of all I actually admire this. I think it's useful. I think this should benefit anyone who uses it and understands it. Is he lifted up everyone around him. He made sure that, and this is one of the more rewarding and actually the easier leadership traits to practice. He made a regular practice of making everyone around him feel better. And I don't mean he made them feel good. I mean they made him feel better. Better than anyone else has made them feel. Better than they felt a moment ago.
Mm.
And more importantly, and this is part of his influence, he made them feel better when he was around them than when he wasn't. So they became addicted to him, knowing they would always feel better in his presence.
Mm-hmm.
How anyone can apply this is you just have to pay attention to the emotional, the mental states that other people are going through. And know that your words, your interactions with them have an influence. And the only thing you have to do is make them feel better, even a little bit better. And you can do this by affirming their needs, by acknowledging their desires for recognition, for acceptance, for pity, just any of the needs that they may have. You just have to acknowledge it, and you will consistently make them feel better, and they like it. So
Right.
One of the very best leadership traits I can think of. One of the people who actually committed the murders that Charles Manson helped to conspire, Patricia Krenwinkel, she talked about she was with Charles Manson, and they were making love, and he just kept telling her how beautiful you are. You are so beautiful, until she started to cry. I mean, she had never heard that before. And so it became impossible to resist that type of influence. And I also like to quote another author. His name is Blair Warren. You can find a book of his on the internet, or at least an essay. It's called One Sentence Persuasion. And it's very simple. It goes, people will do anything for those who encourage their dreams, justify their failures, ally their fears, confirm their suspicions, and help them throw rocks at their enemies.
Mm-hmm. That's a good book.
If you just think about that, if you're able to apply that to anybody, you are automatically going to be in their favor. So again, lift other people up around them, and especially those people who are closest to and in your inner circle. I think one of the easiest ways to do this in conversation is just to ask questions about what people are interested in. So if they're talking about something, you could say, how did you get started in this? What made you decide to do this? What were the challenges that you overcame, and what influenced you to do it like this? And as long as they're talking about things they're interested in, they'll keep talking about it.
Yeah.
And again, you're affirming them, you're lifting them up by this conversation. And interesting, what I've noticed on occasion is when you do this, you will say absolutely nothing about yourself, and yet you will be the most interesting person in their eyes, which I think is just fascinating.
Yeah. It's so interesting, David, how all of these traits that we're talking about, they can be thought of as tools. And all of these tools, like this one, for example, that we're talking about right now, how he lifted up everyone around him. Looking at this, most people would think, wow, that's actually a really good thing to do. It's a tool. And like any tool, it can be used even for the most nefarious purposes. And then other seemingly things that, I guess what I'm trying to say are seemingly manipulative. A lot of times even those are still tools. Those can be used for positive benefit too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Manipulation isn't good or bad in itself. It simply means to move something with intent. So if I, pick up my pen and I move it to one place or another, I'm moving it with intent. And when we're trying to influence people, we are in fact trying to manipulate them. It's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just something that happens when we communicate with people. So, be conscious of it. And there are some really positive ways to help people. I give a couple of recommendations in addition to the questions you can ask is, try to make sure that they talk 10 times more than you do. That's always a good way of uplifting people.
Mm-hmm.
Keep your eye contact without seeming like you're staring at them. So you want to be interested but not creepy, is what I like to say. And also, if you tilt your head slightly, it indicates that there's a sense it's interpreted as interest. Whenever they say something positive, again, it's just a technique. You nod your head and you raise your eyebrows. So really affirmative. Yes, I'm doing it right now, in fact.
If we could see you.
Yes, if you could only see me. And also just simply understand that everyone responds to feeling appreciated, approved, and accepted. So if you can just generate a very simple sentence, I have a very generic sentence here that does all of that. It says, a lot of people wouldn't have been able to do what you did. You did a great job. It was the right thing to do. That's an admirable quality. All those things demonstrate approval, acceptance, and appreciation. And again, you can just repeat that to somebody and they'll start to feel that. And that's one of the big uplifting things that benefit people. And of course, you and I being hypnotists, we have to, most people come to our office and they're ready to be hypnotized. But if you can demonstrate your desire to fulfill these needs for appreciation and acceptance and approval, they are even more willingly going to follow instructions.
Right.
The number 5 in this is self-discipline and paternal behaviors. I think I'll talk about the paternal behavior part mostly here. I had to really think about what paternal behaviors would be. And in a group environment, there's a couple of things that obviously came to mind to me. One is you provide protection. So you overtly or covertly just ensure the person's safety. This is a technique that is used by the most manipulative pimps in the world. They will say to the girls that they're trying to control, I'm going to keep you safe, stay with me, I'll protect you. And you provide their protection and safety. A paternal behavior also includes being the source of sustenance. So, daddy always brings home the bacon is the phrase that I like to use. Then that's common for paternal figures. Sustenance can be physical food, physical nourishment, but it can also be emotional and spiritual. So
sure.
If you're a part of a group and you're having a meal, be the one who brings forth the meal and presents it to people. I've brought you this. I mean, granted, everyone else could have brought the food, but if you're presenting it, they're going to associate with you.
And take credit.
Yeah, great. Yeah, sure. Take credit. Be the one that they look at when they're appreciating the meal. So an emotional sustenance, so that means giving them encouragement, love, and support. And in the case of cults and religious organizations, and of course Charles Manson being the source of spiritual sustenance. And that, that included a huge amount of indoctrination, which we can get into later.
Yeah.
But so if you can think about how to provide protection to the people that you're influencing, how to be in some way considered a source of sustenance. A paternal behavior includes mediating relationships between families. So if you ever grew up with brothers and sisters, sometimes it's going to be one of the parents who says, stop it, you're not going to argue here, you go to your room, or you help your little brother do this. So mediating the relationships. And of course, anyone who does that immediately puts themselves above the actual relationships in a paternal setting. Also, a paternal behavior is to define the relationships within the let's call it the family. Like for example, an older child can be told to supervise a younger child to, learn or play correctly or play this particular game or keep them safe. So if you define a relationship, you can also say, someone is the provider or something like that. A story that I was doing a lot of research on Charles Manson, and there was an interview that ABC News did with him, and the sound engineer, before the interview started, went up to put a microphone on Charles Manson. And what was interesting is what Charles Manson said to him. He said, "Where you from, boy?" He didn't say sir or friend or brother. He said boy.
Right.
And that immediately puts that person in a child relationship. So, and I thought, well, how would I deal with that if Charles Manson said that to me? And I would say, no speaking inmate.
Right.
I just say that. Yeah. So I would put him back in the inmate position.
Put him back in his place.
Yeah. But the sound engineer who was in the interview talking about it said his blood just ran cold when he heard that. It just totally took him out of his state. Also, one of the things Manson did, he would consistently introduce people to new thoughts and ideas. And the interesting thing about this is what it does is it makes them reflect upon their previous life as being boring. So in my experience, I've been in some crazy settings, like going to Burning Man, for example, and everything is new at Burning Man. And yeah, it makes everything prior to Burning Man boring. It can really just sweep you away. Introducing people consistently to new ideas and beliefs. And I think as far as if you are leading a group, there are some really good ways to do that. You would take people aside and just talk about new ideas, things they need to consider that are part of the grand vision. I think it would be very effective.
Yeah.
He also, when he was in prison, when Charles Manson was in prison, he took a course on Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. And that was essentially his only training in influence and persuasion. But since he was in prison, and he also had a strong desire to use his influence to, when he got out, become a pimp and prostitute girls out, he would practice it. And someone who did a book on Charles Manson interviewed another convict who was in prison at the same time Charles Manson was, and the testimony was that you could hear Charles Manson recite Dale Carnegie from his prison cell until he just got it down.
Right.
And if you ever watch him in interviews, he's incredibly good at it. He will mention your name, which is one of the Dale Carnegie. He will treat you as if you're important. He will not deviate his eyes from you. He looks at you as though you're the most important person there. And of course, there are other things, but these are all evident still in how he talks and influences and interacts with people. So he took on Dale Carnegie and really integrated it into his influence.
Yeah, I think that's important that people understand too. Is oftentimes we think that these very persuasive, very influential people are just naturally that way, and in every example that I can think of, that is just not the case. Those people actually rehearsed, they practiced, they studied, they invested time into developing those skills.
Right.
And that's a good lesson that we can take away, not just from him, but from any person that is really influential and powerful that way.
Right. Find a useful technology and just commit yourself to it. I mean, God forbid if he had learned neurolinguistic programming. Oh man, he would have been dangerous. I mean, he would have been even more dangerous. What am I talking about?
Yeah.
Now the number 8 here is something that's a little bit difficult to do. He would insist that people give up their egos as a condition of being with him. Now, that's a little difficult to understand. It took me a while to sort of wrap my head around it and be able to explain it well. Our ego is who we think we are. It is everything that has made us and is part of our memories and our past and our influences. It's essentially our identity. When you ask someone to give up their ego, they become essentially a blank slate. They have nothing to reflect back on. They have nothing to think of as a consequence in the future. They are only in this very moment, and they are totally subject to being in that agenic state that Stanley Milgram talked about. And what's interesting is giving up your ego in a lot of religious organizations, cultures, sects, cults, that is a requirement, or at least it's a recommendation. And there are reasons for it. It is, however, incredibly easy to misuse, because once you have someone who has given up that ego, they are subject to any sort of influence possible. Now, one of the ways he would do this is he would someone would come up and ask him a question. Like a girl would come up and ask him a question, and he would just look at her and say, "You're not ready. You're not ready to know that. You have too much of your parents on you. Get rid of that, come back, and you'll be ready to listen." He will tell people you have to die in your ego to be born again so that you can learn everything here. He would, he would say things like, "You're holding yourself back because you're still living in your mother's head." In fact, in one interview, he was trying to seduce this woman, and she was resisting, and that's what he said to her. And she gave in. She said, he would send her away. "You're living in your mother's head. I don't want you near me. Go away, come back." And she relented. She sort of realized what was going on and gave up her ego in that moment. Now, this is hard to do, and I would say rather questionable to do in other settings. But there are some ways that you can do it. Is you can do it within a context. Let me see. I had some notes here on this.
Well, you talk about, there's one spot in here in particular in that section, David, that I like. And, constantly I'm thinking, so how, as a hypnotherapist, can I use this to my client's benefit? How can I apply these things? And you've got a section down here. It says, it's talking about insisting someone give up their ego.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got some examples here that I think are really pertinent for that particular application. This is not who you are. You're a better person. Or you mentioned here, is that how you want people to see you? Because I see you differently. Or I see something more in you. Are you willing to see that in yourself? I think those things are highly applicable to helping a client to step out of that old way of being into that new way of being.
Absolutely. Yeah, even just for a moment, if they can consider who they think they are as for this moment a limitation, and you can illustrate that to them, they become more willing to accept, the possibilities of being someone different. So it's not a necessarily, can be a very manipulative tool if you have them give up their egos, but in the right context.
Sure.
When you see someone suffering, you're realizing it's part of who they are to cling to that suffering, and you show that to them, they start to be willing to see themselves differently.
Yeah, that's a big part of what we do as hypnotherapists. Is we help people create a new reality, step out of that old identity. Because a lot of times, even with simple issues like smoking cessation, people oftentimes have a challenge not thinking of themselves as a smoker. And that sense of identity can be powerful, and it needs to change.
Right. Again, talking about smokers, my objective is at the end of the hypnosis session is for them to see themselves as a non-smoker.
Mm-hmm. Right.
As something they used to do that, but they're not that person anymore. In fact, I have a whole hypnosis process where you elicit all the positive traits that they want, and I have them become that person so they can look back on themselves and say, literally and with their voice, I am not that person anymore, and really feel it. And so they've given up how they see themselves as before, that old ego, and they see themselves as someone with better traits and better qualities. And often for a smoker, when they see themselves as a non-smoker, sometimes it doesn't even matter if they have cravings. They have a craving, it hurts like hell, and they say, I'm a non-smoker. I'm not that person that I used
Absolutely.
to be anymore. And they just let it go. They walk through it, which I think is always fascinating because it's the same craving, but they don't care.
Right. Yeah, that whole sense of identity is immensely powerful. If you don't have it on your side, you're as good as sunk. But if you do get it on your side, if you can shift that sense of identity, then I think 90% of the battle is won already.
Yeah, absolutely. We're getting near the end. The ninth one is one that is very difficult to apply in today's culture, which is using isolation, LSD, and mandatory sermons.
Yeah, good luck applying that one to your hypnosis clients.
Right, exactly. And
you're going to have to be more creative than me because I can't see how to do that.
And it is really interesting and bizarre how he was able to use LSD. If anyone understands what LSD does, it totally changes every perception. In the right doses, people literally think they can fly, and they have fallen off buildings and stuff like that, taking it. But what he did is he would orchestrate these group LSD events. Usually they were also sexual orgies, in which he would not be taking the LSD. He would be orchestrating their experience. So he would tell them what to experience, and of course under LSD and in the right circumstances, they would experience that. He would recreate crucifixions of Christ with him nailed on the cross, and that's what people would see. So yeah, it's crazy how they would do that, or how he would do that. And as much as I think he's a crazy mofo, I sort of admire the depths that he went to use this drug at the time, which was legal,
Right.
To influence people. And it really can't be overstated, the amount of influence that had on people. Just this orchestrated drug experience that he led them through. And part of that is the isolation in mandatory sermons. Isolation happens in business cultures where you basically say, while you're here, this is your business. If you work here, you turn your cell phone off, so you don't have other influences affecting you, and that actually is useful within the context of the business organization. And there are certain ways where you can orchestrate the isolation. Having mandatory sermons is a little more difficult. I don't even really want to go into that because it's a little crazy, actually. The very last one was he made people feel as though they were in a movie. And this is, again, something I don't think can be overstated. They felt, by being in a movie, they felt totally detached from themselves, as though they were observing what was going on. And that is almost the exact description of the ideal agentic state, where someone is not themselves, not linked to consequences or past behaviors, but just an agent to a process, and where they're detached from their experience, taking part in this, and just sort of looking at it from the side. So, and it's an awesome feeling, I would think. Well, I take that back. People under trauma also separate in the very same way, and sometimes are able to see it in a very detached way, and it becomes that detachment as being in a movie becomes part of the experience. But in this way, he sort of orchestrated it so people felt like they were just watching themselves do things. Yeah.
That takes us back to the Milgram experiments, that same agentic state of being an actor, being a tool of that authority figure,
right, and
or that greater vision.
And with the Milgram experiment, the people who went through, who were taking the teacher role and shocking their compatriots, they were under a huge amount of stress doing it. I mean, some of them were sweating, and all and they would still go through all the way and feel really terrible at the end. But what's interesting is what Charles Manson did. He had these people willingly do it, and they did not feel stress when they were committing these atrocious crimes. I mean, that's a tribute to the quality of indoctrination he put these people through. So think about that. Think about can you bring someone into this agentic state and have them participate in it without feeling stress?
David, do you think that might be largely, and I could be wrong here, but do you think that might be largely a function of the identity that we talked about before?
Yeah.
If someone sees themselves as being someone who does this kind of thing, then if they see themselves that way, then they're going to feel congruent. They're not going to have that stress, that feeling being stressed. But if I would think that would have a lot to do with that. Maybe there's more factors there involved too. But
I think that's a great observation. If you're able to, like I said, get rid of someone's ego, replace it with, something new, you can have them do all sorts of heinous things.
Or wonderful things. Because I'm thinking, how can I use something akin to this agentic state to, and it reminds me very much of the section in the Ellipsis Manual by Chase Hughes, of course, we talked to not too long ago. The helper state.
Yeah.
That seems like another version, another form of this agentic state. And someone who's trying to make a major change in their life and who's struggling with that agentic state or that helper state would be immensely helpful.
Right. And let's articulate what that is. So the agentic state, well, the helper is an entirely separate identity that has all of the positive qualities that the client needs. And so you're, through the hypnosis process, separating the client from, their current state of identity for the moment, associating it into the helper, which is a person who is associated with healthy thoughts and behaviors, loves themselves, is confident, is creative, has a wonderful set of boundaries and ethics that is unfamiliar to the client, but something the client wants. And then you have the helper sort of manipulate the client's body for a while,
Right.
until it becomes integrated. And absolutely, I think that's a great observation, that very much it is what we try and do in a very healthy way with people. And of course, these are just tools, like you say. It's
Right.
Hammer has a lot of different uses, and one of them is to build things up.
And you can also destroy with it. But
Yeah.
hopefully, we are encouraging people to use these tools, just like a hammer, to build and not destroy.
And of course, I want you to, anyone who's listening to this, listen to it again. There's some great information here. I would love some really good feedback on what we've talked about here. And any last words, John?
Yeah, just based on the research that you've done on these topics, what ways could a hypnotist or hypnotherapist apply some of these things, in addition to the things that we've already talked about?
Yeah.
These things that we've learned from somebody as nefarious as Charles Manson. How can we kind of hijack some of his tools actually for people's benefit?
Well, one of the things, and again, I'll attribute Chase Hughes for this, is authority will beat techniques every time. If you present yourself as an authority, like a guy in a lab coat, people will do things because they seem as though, they feel as though you're the right person to instruct them to do this. So start with authority. And of course, everything that we've talked about here and that we do, multitude of techniques and awareness and things you have to pay attention to. But if you start with authority, so think about the types of people you would want to follow and the types of people other people would want to follow. And try and build that persona. Either
do what they do, act the way they would act.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, stand confidently, say things with a sense of certainty and confidence, look people in the eye, listen intently.
Don't hesitate.
Exactly. Don't hesitate. All of those things will build authority. Everything else beyond that, the things that you do, will just contribute to that. So I would probably tell anyone, start by thinking what it means to be an authority in something, and know that people will respond to an authority probably a lot faster than just having a new, cool, creative technique to influence people.
Right.
Right?
Very good.
Okay, well, again, this is in much more detail in my book called Building Your Cult. It's under the author's name is my pen name, Dantalion Jones. Please take a look at it. You can find it on Amazon. And John, you have a book we're going to be talking about next week about the ultimate guide to hypnosis.
That's right. What you need to know to get the change you want.
And that one is also available on Amazon.
Yes, it is.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone who's taken part here. I hope this has been interesting. I would love to hear questions, comments, contributions about future podcasts. And John, thank you again. This has been the Hypnotorious Podcast.
Always fun, David.
Great. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.